most of the areas where the Islamic State is active or has, a presence are effectively off limits to Western journalists. Good afternoon. I'm David Enders. I'm a producer and correspondent for Vice, covering the Middle East. Since January, I've been reporting from Lebanon and Iraq, and we're here to talk today about what's happening in the Middle East, specifically the push by the Islamic State that's seen them take large amounts of territory in Syria and Iraq.
Hey David, thanks for coming on the show, and good afternoon indeed. We've got a bunch of people who want to talk to you, and some of them are on Skype. So let's start with Kaylee, who's calling us from Eugene, Oregon.
Hey David.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So my first question is, in the documentary on Ramadi, it was said that the only international support that they've received so far has been in the form of airstrikes. But this is in contradiction to U.S. claims that their coalition is providing training, arming, consulting, along with air support. Why is there this contradiction?
Well, it's not entirely a contradiction. The U.S. is providing training for Iraqi forces, however, it's been very small, and there have been a number of snags with the Iraqi government who doesn't approve of everyone the U.S. is training. People within the American government have proposed directly arming different factions in Iraq, including Sunni Arab tribes in Anbar province that are pro-government. However, the Iraqi government doesn't want these people directly armed. They want to control the flow of arms. There's also been attacks on some of the bases where the U.S. was training. So training has been intermittent, it's been suspended, and we just really haven't seen any real effects of it yet.
Okay. Then how many other cities in Iraq are in the same situation as Ramadi was last month?
There are many cities and towns that are in similar situations that have been laid siege to by the Islamic State, not just in Iraq, but also in Syria. Particularly in Anbar province, there are areas where sometimes the Islamic State is in control, sometimes government forces are in control, sometimes effectively no one is in control. But there are a number of different cities that are in a similar way.
Okay, then why hasn't the mainstream media really kept up with these cities?
Well, one thing is that they're inaccessible, effectively. We were the first, Vice News was the first crew that had traveled to Ramadi, actually into the city, in almost a year.
Wow.
And that's because it's extremely dangerous to get there. It's extremely dangerous once you're there, and if you're going further west than Ramadi, or also in eastern Syria, most of the areas where the Islamic State is active or has, a presence are effectively off limits to Western journalists.
Okay, last question. What factors do you think have led to ISIS's advancement in Iraq?
Well, the primary factor is the massive disenfranchisement of not just Iraqis, but Syrians at the hands of the Iraqi and Syrian governments, and also as a result of the American invasion in 2003. When the U.S. disbanded the Iraqi Army, they took away means of support from hundreds of thousands of people, and many of them were then barred from finding other jobs in government. And Iraq, like many Middle Eastern countries, is a place where most jobs come from the government, from one government ministry or another. So people have been very receptive to virtually any group that's fighting the Iraqi government or that claims to represent their interests when they're pretty convinced that the Iraqi government doesn't represent their interests.
Okay.
Thanks for your questions. Those were great.
Thank you. It was great talking with you.
All right, thanks, Kaylee. So, David, we got a tweet from Rick Grimes, who wants to know why, despite claims that they're better armed and they have more fire support than the Islamic State, the Iraqi army continues to retreat in the face of battle. Why do you think that is?
Well, one, I think, misconception is that the Iraqi army at this point is better armed than the Islamic State. They do have air support. However, the Iraqi government's air support is not particularly effective. And even the number of U.S. airstrikes versus the number of Islamic State elements on the ground are somewhat insignificant. You also have the Islamic State capturing heavy weaponry, including anti-armor rockets, from Syrian regime stockpiles. You have them capturing American equipment, especially armored Humvees and even tanks from the Iraqi Army, which then are being turned on the Iraqi Army to pretty substantial effect. And then finally, you have the fact that the Iraqi Army, even before the Islamic State's push, was on paper much bigger than it actually was. The corruption was considerable, and there were, in some cases, people suggest hundreds of thousands of what are called ghost soldiers, where these were people who were officially on the payroll, had either deserted or never even shown up for duty in the first place, and their commanders were simply collecting their paychecks. So you have a very determined fighting force versus a force with somewhat low morale, very corrupt leadership, and like I just said, not necessarily in possession of better weapons at all times than the Islamic State. And these car bombs that they've used, especially in the takeover of Ramadi, have been devastating.
Well, thanks for that answer. I hope that answered all of your questions, Rick. So we got some more people on Skype, and let's go to Mix next, who's calling us from Latvia. So let's say to Mix.
How's it going, Mix?
Yeah. Hey, hi. Hi, thanks for the amazing coverage of the events in the Middle East, first of all. That's
Thanks for
I've learned
watching.
quite a lot. Yeah. The question that I had is whether you see military engagement at its current form as a sustainable way to combat the Islamic State, or are there other more effective initiatives that can run in parallel and that can help restore stability?
Well, I don't think a lot of people want to think about it, but at some point, negotiations with the Islamic State are probably going to be necessary. Traditionally, just using an American example, American policy is often what they call a two-track policy, where you have a military option but also diplomatic engagement, whether it's very secretive, whether it's back-channel, but it exists. In 2007, 2008, U.S. Military commanders were actually engaging with Iraqi groups that were fighting the U.S. military. They were having secret meetings in Jordan, looking for a political solution. One was never reached, which is part of the reason you have the Islamic State now. Same thing with the U.S. military and the Afghan government speaking to elements of the Taliban in a similar way. And I think if there's any hope for the situation in Afghanistan to be resolved, it's through some kind of political accommodation. The Islamic State, it's difficult because they do seem like a group that cannot be negotiated with. But it's also important to keep in mind that one of the major reasons they exist is because of American military intervention in the first place that occurred in 2003 and left so many people disenfranchised, destroyed. Cities like Fallujah was almost entirely destroyed by the U.S. military, and now you see that was the first Iraqi city to fall under Islamic State control more than a year ago. So, I don't think these things are coincidences. So your question's extremely important, and hopefully we'll see political leaders start to make some very difficult but necessary decisions.
But given the plurality of all the leaders that exist within this Islamic State, and there are so many different types of groups, how would a national state actually decide who to negotiate with? What do you think?
Well, the Islamic State does seem to have a very clear leadership structure. At some point, as they further formalize themselves, I imagine they would even elect people to deal with foreign relations. I mean, you see them talking about issuing passports. The Islamic State wants to have all the trappings of a state. So I certainly think there will be down the line intermediaries, and whether it's the U.S.'s role is not necessarily direct negotiations, but I think some of the local actors will certainly have to engage with these people, and I think in some cases already are engaged with these people. The Turkish government managed to free 50 hostages in Mosul from the Islamic State. So obviously there is communication there.
Mm-hmm. All right, great, thanks.
Thank you
for the answer.
Yeah, thanks, Mix, for coming on. So, David, we have someone else who I wanted you to speak to on Skype, and this is Niall, who's calling us from Brooklyn. So let's say hi to Niall.
How's it going?
Hey, David, how's it going? Thanks for having
Not
me
bad.
on. My question was, does the ideology of ISIS have legitimate staying power in the region, even if ISIS itself were to be defeated, like, pretty soon?
Unfortunately, I think it does have resonance. And that's because, again, of this massive disenfranchisement of people by local governments, by the Syrian government, by the Iraqi government, by the Egyptian government, by the Libyan government. And then these powers are often backed by outside powers, by Western or European powers, and that further drives antipathy toward the West. And we see ISIS's or the Islamic State's ideology sort of building around that, and just Iraq being the most the most important example. These areas where you've seen the Islamic State become very strong and actually take and hold territory. If you look at a map of where, at one point the US was running the largest prison in the world in southern Iraq. Camp Bucca had nearly 30,000 people in it. And if you looked at the demographics, they were very heavily, these people who the US was arresting in mass arrests very heavily came from these areas. These are the people who have been extremely, extremely disenfranchised.
Definitely. My second question, thanks for that, by the way. My second question is a little unrelated, and it's what is Iran's role in Syria, considering their unique position as opponents of ISIS but allies of Assad?
Well, Iran's position at this point across the region, their foreign policy has been for a long time to support effectively Shiite Muslim militants across the region. And not just Shiite Muslim militants, but militants in general until the Arab Spring, and we've seen this very defined split between different groups. Iran also funded Hamas because they were fighting against the Israeli government. And now you've seen that change a little bit. So Iran's role in supporting the Syrian government, in supporting the Iraqi government, and in supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, so if effectively Iran is supporting people fighting the Islamic State on 3 different fronts, their role has become one of provocateur, because in some sense, supporter and provocateur, because the Islamic State turns around and extreme Sunnah ideology labels Shiite Muslims as apostates. And so the Islamic State says, okay, you don't want Iran here. Iran is trying to increase its influence. We have to fight Iran. And it becomes kind of cyclical. So Iran's involvement in supporting these governments is kind of a catch-22, because in some ways it catalyzes attacks on these same governments. Does that make sense? Does that help?
It does. And somewhat related is, I think a lot of analysts and pundits as of recent have kind of claimed that Assad must fall in order to defeat ISIS. And what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's true?
Well, I think any binary in situations like this is dangerous. You're with us or you're with the terrorists. No, Assad does not need to fall to defeat ISIS or to defeat the Islamic State. It's not an either-or proposition. what needs to happen to defeat. I couldn't actually say what needs to happen to defeat the Islamic State, but the idea that Assad going is a precondition is not, I think, valid.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Niall, thank you so much for coming on. So, David, we have a bunch of tweets that are coming in right now, and I want to start with this one that Justin sent us. He wants to know if you think that the Gulf states are tacitly supporting the Islamic State against, or as a buffer against Iran.
That's an extremely difficult question. The Islamic State, more than any other group fighting in Syria and Iraq, and this is part of its success, has managed to find its own revenue streams. It sells oil. It has sold machinery from factories it's taken over all across Syria, or all across northern and eastern Syria. It's actually sold those into southern Turkey. It extorts money, it levels taxes. It was doing that in Mosul even before it effectively outright took it over. There are also, more than likely, individual donations coming from the Gulf and other countries, although actually drawing a line between any single government actor and the Islamic State is probably unlikely and extremely difficult. Mostly because the Islamic State also represents a threat to the government of Saudi Arabia, to the government of Jordan, and to other Arab governments. Certainly, though, the Saudis do like the idea of a buffer between them and Iran. It was one reason that at one point they had decent relations with Saddam Hussein. And I think they would like to see probably more controllable or slightly more moderate groups in power. At this point, as an alternative to the Islamic State, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar are effectively backing slightly more moderate jihadi rebels who are very much aligned and fight alongside al-Qaeda and even share their resources with them. But drawing a direct line between Gulf states and the Islamic State, I think, is quite difficult and probably a little too simple for the complexity of the situation.
Cool. So, hey, David, we actually are getting a bunch of tweets while we're live right now that I think are worth addressing. We got this one that I want you to take a look at. Actually, two I'm going to give you back to back. Do you think the Islamic State is close to doing anything significant in Jordan? And also, we have Andrew who's asking if the fall of, or an attack on Baghdad is inevitable given what we've seen in Ramadi recently. So what do you think about those two things? What could happen in Jordan and what might happen to Baghdad?
I'll start with the Baghdad question. And an Islamic State push on Baghdad or an effective campaign against Baghdad is unlikely because of demographics. Baghdad in 2003 was probably about 50% Sunnah, 50% Shiite, and often people didn't talk about their sex, and you found a lot of intermarriage. In the years after the invasion, you saw most of the Sunnis being driven out of Baghdad. And when the Islamic State made its major offensive push last year, they were approaching down the road from northern Iraq, the main highway, to Baghdad, and they were stopped outside Baghdad by a mass mobilization of Shiite militiamen. And that's what you would see in Baghdad again if they were to move on it. They would have to have extreme military superiority, and that just doesn't seem likely based on the numbers of people who would actually rise up to defend Baghdad. I think it would be very, very difficult for them to do it, and not in their interest. I think we'll see them hold territory, consolidate their hold on certain territory, and then it's more likely they would move on Damascus before Baghdad, just simply because the Syrian army seems to be rapidly falling apart in some parts of the country. The question as far as Jordan and whether the Islamic State is close to doing something in Jordan, it's a really popular thing to say, oh, this time the Jordanian government is really in trouble because of this or that. And the Jordanian government has been more or less stable, although more or less dependent on military and humanitarian aid for its survival. But it's been stable for decades, and they have a very effective security service that has very much managed to shut the border between Jordan and Syria, and the Jordanian government is aware of pretty much anything coming or going over that border. I can't say certainly that a tipping point has been reached in Jordan, but I think the vast majority of stakeholders in Jordan and in the Jordanian government don't have any interest in seeing this kind of unrest that's engulfed the other countries. And I don't think you'd see Jordan. We're talking about buffer states. Jordan is a buffer state, and I think you would see pretty rapid American military intervention, possibly boots on the ground, if Jordan were to be threatened.
Great. So thanks for your questions, guys. Speaking of questions, we've got another person on Skype. Let's say hi to Sorab, who's calling us from Dubai.
Thanks
Hi,
for
David.
being
How
with
are
us. Good. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good. Well, my first question is that in an interview, Mr. Assad with CBS News, in an interview with CBS News, Mr. Assad claims that American-led airstrikes are not defeating ISIS. Basically, generally, ISIS has expanded more than before. And in another interview, Mr. Assad claims that I'm sorry about that. In another interview, Mr. Assad claims that his regime sometimes bombs ISIS more than the whole America and its allies. So, which means that America and its Western allies or Arab allies are not serious about bombing ISIS. Well, that basically makes sense, because if America can drone Taliban hideouts in tribal regions and mountainous regions of Afghanistan or Pakistan, why can't it like a group of 300 foreign ISIS fighters in bare ground? So, what do you say about that?
Well,
Which led ISIS to advance in Ramadi and Pomria.
Well, the first thing about the bombing campaign is that the U.S. and other governments have gone to lengths to avoid civilian casualties. Civilian casualties have still occurred, but it is partially that concern that keeps the allies or the coalition or whatever you want to call it from bombing directly inside Mosul, from bombing directly inside Ramadi or Raqqa, at least at this point. It remains to be seen if that's the path that will be taken. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you've got to take some of the reports of how effective these airstrikes are with a bit of skepticism. And thousands have been carried out, but if the intelligence was extremely good, these tens of thousands of airstrikes would have had a bit more of an effect. When the American military, the Pentagon says we took out an ISIS offensive element, or we took out an ISIS vehicle, that might mean two guys with Kalashnikovs on the back of a dirt bike. Aside from wondering if, the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on that bomb are really worth taking out two militants of questionable worth. But you're seeing them take out things at a very slow pace, and and the Islamic State has built on the knowledge of its predecessor organization, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which also fought the U.S. and is very familiar with American tactics, how to avoid airstrikes, not to mass in large groups in a single area where they can be taken out. They move frequently. So these are all reasons why the air campaign is not as effective as maybe it could be. It's also, I think, a lack of intelligence. When we're talking about Afghan Pakistan, you've had, at this point, the U.S. has, and they do get better at this as time goes on, over a decade to build up intelligence assets. And theoretically, they have some people on the ground who are helping them with those strikes. Whereas, as far as intelligence on the ground, a lot of the areas controlled by the Islamic State really are a black hole.
Okay, that's good. Well, the flow of recruits up to even Mr. Assad claims that up to 1,000 recruits every month joins ISIS in Syria from all around the world. Again, if America was serious about defeating ISIS, why doesn't it take measures? If even America and its allies has taken measures against recruitments and people joining ISIS, why is it still not effective? Why is it still useless?
Well, that's a really great question. And it's a question that needs to be posed to the Turkish government, which is very much complicit in the rise of the Islamic State by allowing material and fighters to cross the Turkish border with very little. The Turks have made it very easy to cross, and the U.S. government has criticized them, certainly behind the scenes, and once even openly, maybe about 6 months ago, the vice president actually complained about this on television and very quickly retracted what he had said. The U.S. needs Turkey as an ally, or wants Turkey as an ally, and is trying not to offend them. Turkey also has an interest in allowing fighters into Syria because of their disagreements with the Assad government, and in return, Assad has helped build up Kurdish militants along the Turkish border, which has increased tension further. In large part, this is an issue with the Turkish government, who could be far, far more effective in patrolling their border and in keeping people from crossing and joining ISIS. I mean, that's the Islamic State. That's the major point where they've come from.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for answer.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, Saurabh, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks a lot.
David, we're getting near the end of the show, but there's one thing I want to have you address that we got on Twitter from Jason Lewis. Jason asked what he thinks is a simple question. Why don't we work with Assad to destroy the Islamic State?
That is a good question. We actually have a clip from a video that went live on Vice News this week, shot by one of our colleagues inside Syria. So let's cut to that really quick.
هذه بعض القصص المدنية التي قام النظام بتصفيتها، وهؤلاء العساكر رفضوا قتل المدنيين حسب طبعا تقرير أحد العساكر الموجود عندنا. والحمد لله رب العالمين يعني تم التعرف على بعضنا، والآخر لم يتم التعرف حتى الآن. وندعو كل من له معتقل في مشفى جلسة الشهور فيراجع الدفاع المدني لكي يتعرف على هؤلاء الجثث. قام النظام بتصفيتهم قبل خروجه بساعات قليلة، وكما ترى لا رائحة لهم ولا هم حديثي الموت.
So that clip we just saw was filmed in northern Syria a couple weeks ago, and those are basically Al-Qaeda fighters looking at what appears to be evidence of a Syrian military massacre of prisoners before they fled that base. And that is a scene that for me is very hard to watch, and I would imagine for many of our viewers is very off-putting. For Syrians, that is a very common scene. We've seen a lot of attention paid to Islamic State atrocities and mass killings. We've seen much less focus in the last couple of years on the atrocities and the mass killings committed by the Syrian government. So if the US were to come in on the side of Assad, they're essentially picking an actor who is, in his tactics, not that much different from the Islamic State. The crimes that have been committed by the Syrian government are one of the reasons the Islamic State has support, and why people are sometimes supportive of these atrocities rather than appalled by them. But thank you for the question. It's one that's come up a lot, especially within American politics.
Yeah, and it's an important question to answer. So, David, thanks for answering everyone's questions today. Why don't
Anytime.
you say goodbye to the people at home?
Thanks a lot for joining us, and please join us next week.
يعني أكثريتنا انهزمت ركض بدون حتى تكرم أحدية. ركض يعني بس في سبيل شلون تتخلص نفسها يعني لأنه المدفعية ما شاء الله وهم من هناك يضربون فصرنا احنا شلون تقول بالنص.
What will you do if this part of Ramadi is taken over by the Islamic State?
داعش يريد يدخل لهنا والله الأفضل احنا نموت بمكاننا يعني ما وين نروح بعد لأنه